The sound of a slap echoed through the first-class cabin like an unexpected gunshot. Conversations immediately ceased. The flight attendants froze statuesque. In the sudden silence, 17-year-old Caleb Preston touched his hot, stinging cheek. His wide brown eyes filled with shock as he looked up at the elderly man standing before him, his face flushed with anger. "This place is not for you." The man spat, his voice shaking with rage. "I paid $20,000 to have peace, not to sit with." Before he could finish, the plane cabin erupted into chaos. Two burly men in sharp suits bolted from the front rows. In mere seconds, they had subdued the attacker, forcing him against the wall, his arms bound tightly behind his back. Over the intercom, a flight attendant's voice crackled in panic. "Captain, there's a serious incident in the first-class cabin. In seat 2A, Nathaniel Preston remained calm. His face was almost impassive, but he gently placed a hand on his son's arm. "Stay calm," he whispered, his eyes flickering with a storm hidden deep within. We've prepared for moments like this. No one noticed the woman seated in 3C, quietly recording everything on her phone. No security, no flight attendants, and even Captain Grace Nakamura in the cockpit didn't realize it, as she urgently communicated with air traffic control, requesting an emergency landing. What was supposed to be a routine flight was about to forever change the lives of everyone on board. But to understand how everything spiraled into disaster, we must rewind 4 hours earlier to Kennedy International Airport. At the boarding gate, Teresa Monroe had worked as a gate agent for 27 years, yet she still couldn't get used to the ridiculous theater that played out every time first-class passengers prepared to board. She stood there observing the crowd of wealthy, arrogant individuals crowding around the gate like impatient vultures, despite her repeated announcements that there were still at least 15 minutes before boarding would begin. "Excuse me," a cold, sharp voice rang out, exactly matching its owner's imposing presence. Teresa looked up and saw a silver-haired man dressed in a gray suit that was undoubtedly worth more than her monthly salary. The name tag on his coat identified him as Dr. Richard Holloway, Chief of Thoracic Surgery at Massachusetts General Hospital. "I need to board early," he said, barely glancing at her. "I have an important meeting in 20 minutes. I need to settle in Teresa." Had heard requests like this throughout her career. Everyone seemed to think their time was more valuable than anyone else's. "Sorry, Dr. Holloway," she replied evenly. "But we haven't been cleared to board yet. I'll make sure you're prioritized as soon as we start, Doctor." Holloway suppressed his irritation with a forced smile. "Perhaps you don't understand," he said. "I'm presenting groundbreaking research at the American Medical Association's conference this afternoon. Lives depend on me being on time." Just then a young woman with a guide dog stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I believe the priority boarding policy applies to passengers with disabilities and those needing special assistance." "Doctor." Holloway turned around, his expression shifting from annoyance to condescension as he noticed the white cane in the woman's hand. Of course, he shrugged dramatically. "Go ahead." As the young woman gently made her way to the jet bridge, Dr. Holloway muttered under his breath, just loud enough for only Teresa to hear. "Of course, while some of us are busy saving humanity." Teresa ignored the comment and smiled at the woman. "Thank you. Naomi Singh. Do you need any further assistance?" "No, thank you. I'm fine." Naomi smiled gently, petting her golden retriever. Daisy, who sat obediently beside her, soon after Teresa noticed a well-dressed black man approaching, accompanied by a young teenager. Both were wearing tailored suits, and their ties, bold with blue and gold patterns, stood out as both refined and eye-catching. "Good morning," the man greeted in a deep voice. "I'm Nathaniel Preston, and this is my son, Caleb." Teresa blinked in recognition. In Boston, who didn't know Nathaniel Preston, the self-made tech billionaire philanthropist and the first black man to own a major sports team in the city? He had once funded the rebuilding of the Children's Hospital, where Dr. Holloway worked. "We are honored to welcome you today." Teresa smiled as she checked their tickets. "Seats 2A and 2B first class. We'll begin boarding shortly." Caleb stood beside his father, fidgeting with excitement. Despite wearing a luxurious suit, he still carried the awkwardness typical of a 17-year-old dad. "Can I grab a drink before we board?" Caleb Preston asked, his eyes hopeful. Nathaniel Preston glanced at his watch and nodded. "Hurry up, we have 10 minutes before we board." Caleb hurried over to the nearby retail counter. Nathaniel turned to Teresa Monroe, offering a friendly smile. "Is Captain Grace Nakamura flying today? She's an old friend of mine." "Yes, sir," Teresa responded, surprised he remembered the pilot's name. "I believe so." "Good. Please let her know I'm on the flight. I'd like to have a word with her." In the corner of the waiting room, Dr. Richard Holloway watched the scene with a displeased expression. "What a joke," he thought to himself. Another passenger acting like they're important, slowing everything down. In Holloway's eyes, a well-dressed black man like that could only be a singer or athlete, someone who earned millions by throwing a ball or dancing, while people like him who dedicated their entire lives to medicine were treated like second-class citizens. Meanwhile, at the airport cafe, Caleb stood behind an elderly couple in line. The woman in her early 70s clung tightly to her husband's arm, whispering anxiously, "Harold, are you sure we should be flying?" Lisa said she could drive us to pick us up. The elderly man chuckled softly, patting his wife's hand. "Helen, we've flown to visit the grandkids twice a year for the past 15 years. I'm not going to quit now just because of a little heart arrhythmia." The doctor gave me the go-ahead. Helen still seemed uneasy. "But what if something happens during the flight?" George Whitman winked playfully at his wife. "Then I'll go out in the place I love best, torturing you at 30,000 feet. His teasing remark made Helen gently punch him on the arm. Caleb smiled faintly. They reminded him of his own grandparents, the way true love often shows itself in affectionate bickering. When it was his turn, Caleb quickly bought a bottle of water and a protein bar. Checking his watch, he was startled. If he didn't hurry back, his dad would definitely start getting anxious. On his way back to the gate, Caleb almost collided with a middle-aged man, in a hurry, wearing a wrinkled shirt, clutching a laptop, a cup of coffee, and a thick technical book. "Sorry," Caleb quickly stepped aside. "No problem," the man replied without looking up from his phone. "Do you know if the San Francisco flight has boarded yet?" "Not yet, but they'll be calling first class soon." "Ah, I'm in economy." "I still have time to hit the restroom," the man said dismissively as he walked away. As Caleb neared the gate, he saw his father speaking with a flight attendant who had just come out from the jet bridge. Her name tag read, "Lauren Brooks, I'm back," Nathaniel said, as Caleb approached Lauren. "Just informed me. There's a slight technical issue. Nothing serious, but it looks like the flight might be delayed by about 20 minutes. Nearby, Dr. Holloway was waiting by the boarding door. Overhearing the news, he approached with an annoyed tone. "Excuse me, is there a problem with the plane? I have a very important presentation this afternoon." Lauren maintained a professional smile. "We're just completing some routine checks, sir. Passenger safety is our top priority. We expect a slight delay." "Unacceptable," Holloway muttered. "I chose this flight specifically for its punctuality. I should have taken the 6 a.m. flight." Nathaniel turned to look at him, his gaze indifferent. "If you want peace of mind, I've noticed that medical conferences rarely start on time. The organizers always prepare for situations like this." Holloway gave Nathaniel a scrutinizing glance, then looked at the tailored suit, his confident posture, and the young man beside him before shrugging dismissively. "You don't understand," Holloway snapped. "I'm not presenting some trivial business project. I'm introducing a groundbreaking procedure that will save the lives of thousands of heart patients." Before Nathaniel could respond, the intercom blared, cutting off the confrontation. "Attention! We would like to invite global service members, active military personnel, and passengers needing special assistance to board Naomi Singh, with her guide dog, Daisy, made her way to the jet bridge. Nathaniel placed his hand on Caleb's shoulder. Wait a moment before we go. No need to rush. Caleb nodded, impressed by how naturally calm his father was, another live lesson on how to use privilege with humility. Soon the announcement continued, inviting first-class passengers to board at any time. Dr. Holloway immediately stepped forward, ticket in hand, striding with a self-important air. Behind him, the elderly couple, George and Helen Whitman, walked hand in hand, moving slowly. "Ready, son?" Nathaniel asked. "Actually, I'd like to use the restroom quickly," Caleb said quietly. Nathaniel checked his watch and nodded. "Hurry up, I'll hold the seat for you when we get on." Nathaniel joined the line of passengers, politely standing behind the Whitmans. As he passed Holloway, he simply nodded. Dr. Richard Holloway, adjusting his briefcase, looked up when Nathaniel Preston casually struck up a conversation. "Attending the medical conference?" Nathaniel asked, in a calm, polite tone. Holloway seemed slightly surprised, as if he wasn't used to such open conversation in settings like this. "Yes, the AMA's annual innovation conference." He replied shortly, "I sponsored the conference last year." Nathaniel nodded. "There were some fascinating developments in robotic surgery." A flicker of recognition crossed Holloway's eyes. "You work in medicine as well, mainly in technology." Nathaniel smiled, extending his hand. "Nathaniel Preston." "Richard Holloway." Mass General Holloway responded, shaking hands perfunctorily, but his demeanor had shifted slightly. The quantum technologies of Preston Systems International. Holloway said, "I've read about your initiatives with Johns Hopkins." Nathaniel nodded. "We're making progress. It might not be as fast as surgical innovation, but we hope to revolutionize medical simulation within the next 5 years. As the two continued chatting, Caleb Preston returned and quietly stood beside his father. Holloway glanced at him quickly, then turned back to Nathaniel. "Perhaps we can continue our conversation on the plane." Holloway suggested, "Your medical technologies align closely with my interests." "Certainly," Nathaniel replied as they walked towards the gate. Teresa Monroe greeted them with a bright smile. "Welcome aboard, gentlemen. Mr. Preston, Captain Grace. Nakamura asked me to send her regards. She hopes to catch up with you once the plane reaches cruising altitude." Nathaniel thanked her, then walked with Caleb down the jet bridge, both unaware that this seemingly routine flight was about to take them on a turbulent journey. Inside the first-class cabin of Atlantic Airlines, Flight 815. The luxury was carefully calculated to feel special without being so extravagant that it would discomfort the shareholders. 12 lie-flat seats were arranged in 3 rows, private enough not to feel exposed, but not completely isolated. Each seat functioned as a bed, and the ratio of attendants to passengers was much higher than in economy. Lauren Brooks, the head flight attendant, greeted each passenger by name, a skill so polished that it impressed many. "Dr. Holloway, seat 1A to your right." She directed Mr. and Mrs. Whitman, seats 1D and 1F, across the aisle. "Mr. Preston and Caleb, seats 2A and 2B, just behind Dr. Holloway." Nathaniel led Caleb to their seats. "Window or aisle?" he asked, although he already knew the answer. "Window, Dad," Caleb replied quickly. At 17, he still felt the thrill of watching the world shrink beneath the wings of the plane. As the two settled in, Nathaniel observed the cabin slowly filling. In seat 3A, a woman with short gray hair in her 50s was engrossed in her laptop, seemingly ignoring the announcement to turn off electronic devices. Across the aisle in seat 3C, an elegant woman in her 60s wearing a fine cashmere outfit was closely watching the boarding passengers. The last passenger to board first class was a man in his 30s, looking rushed, holding a leather briefcase and wearing a wrinkled suit. Excuse me, 3D," he muttered awkwardly as he squeezed past the seats. As passengers in economy and business class began boarding, Lauren moved efficiently through the cabin, offering drinks before takeoff. "I'll start with sparkling water." Nathaniel smiled as she approached. "And Caleb just wants still water." From the seat in front, Holloway's voice rang out clearly. "Is that Krug? I'll have a glass of the same." The woman in seat 3C, the elegant lady in cashmere, turned to Caleb. "First time flying first class, dear." Before Caleb could answer, Nathaniel gently interjected, "Mrs. Evelyn Harrington." Nathaniel nodded in greeting Caleb, "And I have been fortunate to travel together many times since he was young. My work takes me around the world, and I believe travel is an essential part of education." Evelyn nodded in agreement. "Exactly, my late husband thought the same. Working in international banking, he took our children everywhere." "I recognize your name, Mr. Preston. Your foundation does wonderful work for education." "Thank you," Nathaniel responded modestly. "We just try to open more doors for the next generation." From seat 3D, the wrinkled suit man looked up, his eyes lighting up with recognition. "Preston? Nathaniel Preston of Preston Systems International." Nathaniel turned his head slightly. "Yes, Ryan Keller Nexus. Ventures." The man introduced himself quickly. "We've been trying to get in touch with your team for months about a Series B fundraising round for our medical imaging startup." Nathaniel smiled courteously. "Send the materials directly to me. I'll make sure they're reviewed carefully." As small conversations blossomed around the cabin, Caleb noticed that Dr. Holloway was quietly observing everyone with a calculating gaze. He declined Lauren's offer of a warm towel and kept glancing at his watch, appearing impatient. In seat 1D, Mrs. Helen Whitman held George Whitman's hand tightly as the plane began to taxi away from the gate. "Did you take your medicine?" she whispered, loud enough for those around her to hear. "Yes, dear, morning, noon, and night," George chuckled softly. "You remind me more than the doctor does," from seat 3A. The gray-haired woman looked up from her laptop briefly, frowning at the murmurs, and then happened to catch Nathaniel's eye. They exchanged a slight nod, silently acknowledging each other's presence. A brief moment of recognition passed between Nathaniel Preston and the gray-haired woman before she nodded slightly and returned her focus to the laptop screen. "Who is that, Dad, Caleb?" Preston whispered. "Patricia Monroe." Nathaniel replied softly. "A former federal prosecutor. She now heads the ethics boards for several major tech corporations. A sharp woman and a formidable opponent in negotiations." The safety briefing music began to play. While the other passengers stowed away their electronics, Dr. Richard Holloway deliberately continued reading his documents, ignoring Lauren Brooks' polite reminder. It wasn't until she stood directly beside him that he sighed audibly and finally put away his file. The plane slowly began to taxi down the runway, joining the long line of planes waiting to take off. In the economy cabin, the remaining passengers, including Naomi Singh and the wrinkled suited engineer Caleb had bumped into earlier, were settling into their seats for the 6-hour flight. In the cockpit, Captain Grace Nakamura and First Officer Ethan Carter completed their pre-flight checks. Neither of them knew that today's flight would be one of the most memorable of their careers. "Weather looks clear up to the Rockies," Ethan reported. "There's a storm system forming over Nevada, but we'll loop north to avoid it." Good Grace nodded. "By the way, Nathaniel Preston is on this flight, the tech billionaire. Do you know him? My daughter and his son were in the same class. Good guy, not like some of these VIPs who cause trouble." As they continued their professional routine, the aircraft finally reached the threshold for takeoff. The chatter in the first-class cabin quieted down as the engines began to roar. The plane sped down the runway, pushing the passengers back into their seats. Caleb pressed his eyes to the window, watching as the ground faded away and disappeared beneath the clouds. Beside him, Nathaniel briefly closed his eyes, a habit he had from when he used to be afraid of flying. Now it was just a ritual, marking the transition between two worlds. As the plane tilted and flew over Boston Bay, the morning sunlight reflected off the deep blue water. The city where Nathaniel had built his fortune from scratch now looked like a cluster of small buildings beneath the wings. However, no one in the first-class cabin knew that the most dramatic events of the flight were still to come. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the cabin pressure began to settle into its familiar rhythm. Lauren Brooks and her colleague Andrew Lewis moved quickly down the aisle, taking lunch orders and serving drinks. The awkwardness of strangers sitting together began to fade, replaced by the strange familiarity of people sharing the same space. 35,000 feet above the ground, Nathaniel opened his tablet, reviewing his presentation, occasionally making notes with a stylus. Beside him, Caleb alternated between reading the biography of Katherine Johnson, the NASA mathematician, and gazing out at the scenery stretching beneath the plane. "Excuse me," Dr. Holloway's voice broke the silence. He stood halfway up, calling to Lauren. "Could you adjust the cabin temperature? It's quite warm." Lauren smiled professionally. "I'll check with the cockpit, sir." "In the meantime, would you like some more cold water?" "No, I need to stay alert for my presentation." With that, Holloway glanced quickly at Nathaniel. "Mr. Preston, I heard you mention medical simulation work. Could you share more about it?" Nathaniel put his stylus down. "We're developing quantum algorithms that can simulate cellular responses to experimental treatments thousands of times faster than current methods. The goal is to drastically reduce the time between drug development and clinical trials." Their exchange quickly captured the attention of others in the cabin. From Seat 3D, Ryan Keller leaned forward, eager to join the conversation. "That's exactly the field our startup is pursuing, using artificial intelligence to predict drug interactions without animal testing. A noble goal." Nathaniel nodded. Although the AI approach is quite different from quantum computing. Dr. Holloway listened intently, but his eyes still held a hint of skepticism. These kinds of technologies always promise revolution, but in practice they rarely deliver clinical results as expected. "That's history." Nathaniel responded gently. "Thanks to our collaboration with Johns Hopkins, we've reduced the time for simulating heart tissue reactions by 78%. This piece of information made Holloway sit up straighter, now paying particularly close attention. "Heart tissue. My field," he said. "Exactly," Nathaniel confirmed. "We chose cardiovascular surgery for our pilot application because of its complexity and high risk." At this point, Patricia Monroe, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. "What have you done to minimize algorithmic bias? AI in medicine has a poor history when it comes to representing minority groups." Nathaniel turned to her with genuine respect in his eyes. "That's a perfectly valid concern, Mrs. Monroe. We intentionally sourced additional data from underrepresented populations and built our own verification system to detect biases in results." The conversation grew more lively and in-depth. Meanwhile, Caleb politely excused himself to use the restroom, leaving the group of adults deep in their more weighty discussions. On his way toward the front cabin, Caleb Preston happened to see Helen Whitman gently handing her husband a few pills, her hands slightly trembling. George Whitman, catching Caleb's gaze, winked reassuringly. "My wife worries I'll have a stroke mid-flight," he joked as Caleb passed by. "I told her, if anything happens, at least I'll rest peacefully in first class instead of cramped in economy," George Helen chided affectionately, though there was more concern than anger in her eyes. Caleb chuckled softly. "My grandma says the same thing drives my dad crazy." When Caleb returned to his seat, the atmosphere around his father had changed. Evelyn Harrington was sharing stories of her late husband's adventures in Saudi Arabia, while Ryan Keller was trying to steer the conversation back to the issue of investment funding. Dr. Richard Holloway had opened his medical journal again, clearly uninterested in any conversation outside his area of expertise. Lauren Brooks appeared beginning to serve lunch. She smoothly set white napkins over each table with practiced motions. "We have 2 options today," she announced. Pan-seared salmon with quinoa and seasonal vegetables, or grilled chicken breast with truffle mushroom risotto. For nearly an hour afterward, the first-class cabin was filled with a warm, friendly atmosphere. The initial tensions seemed to have dissipated. Nathaniel Preston discussed with Patricia Monroe the ethical issues surrounding artificial intelligence in medicine, while Caleb found himself drawn into an interesting conversation with Evelyn about her world travels. "You should visit Kyoto during cherry blossom season," Evelyn said, her eyes lighting up as she reminisced. "There's no place more beautiful. I've only been to Tokyo." Caleb replied, "Dad had a meeting, but he also took me to the TeamLab Borderless Digital Art Museum. It was impressive, though I still prefer Monet or Renoir." From the aisle seat, George Whitman chimed in with a warm smile. "We went to Orangerie in Paris to see the real water lilies. Nothing beats the feeling of standing before the original paintings." This small exchange added a little extra spice to the friendly atmosphere enveloping the cabin. Even Dr. Holloway seemed less grim, joining in a conversation with Ryan Keller about the potential for investment in medical startups. Lauren quickly cleared the trays. When she reached Nathaniel and Caleb's row, she leaned down and quietly spoke. "Captain Nakamura wanted to know if you'd like to visit the cockpit after we pass Denver, Mr. Preston. Of course, the visit will be brief to ensure safety. It would be an honor." Nathaniel responded with a smile. "Please pass along my thanks to her." From the seat ahead, Dr. Holloway turned around with a clearly annoyed expression. "Is this the standard procedure?" he growled. Inviting passengers into the cockpit mid-flight, Lauren kept her professional demeanor. "It's the captain's decision for short visits at cruising altitude, sir," she replied. "Would you like to visit as well?" she asked. "No," Holloway replied coldly. "I just find it strange that only a few passengers are invited." The air grew tense for a moment, thick with unspoken words. Nathaniel gently broke the silence. "Dr. Holloway, I've known Captain Nakamura for a long time. Our children were in the same class. This is a personal matter, not a privilege." Holloway just grunted and turned away, but Caleb caught a fleeting look in his eyes, one of both envy and frustration. The lunch concluded and the first-class cabin settled into peaceful tranquility. Some passengers drifted off to sleep, others immersed in their work or books. Caleb quietly observed those around him. Helen and George Whitman had fallen asleep, their hands still clasped together. Evelyn Harrington was jotting something down in a luxurious leather notebook. Patricia Monroe continued to focus intently on her laptop without a break. Nathaniel leaned in and whispered to Caleb, "What are you thinking? I saw the look in your eyes. I'm just observing." "Everyone," Caleb whispered back. "I wonder what their stories are behind those facades." Nathaniel smiled approvingly. "Good. The skilled ones often look deeper than what's on the surface. You'll learn that people often reveal themselves through the smallest details long before they raise their voices." As if to prove this point, Lauren approached with a tray of drinks. When she offered more beverages, Holloway took a cold glass of water with a forced smile, devoid of any warmth. "Thank you. Has the air conditioning improved?" "I'm sorry, sir. The engineering team is working on it, but at this altitude, temperature adjustments will take some time." "Right?" Holloway responded in a sickly sweet tone. Perhaps if everyone adhered to proper standards, things would be more efficient. Lauren maintained her polite face, but Caleb noticed her hands tighten around the tray. Nathaniel noticed too, his eyes never leaving that subtle gesture, as though he were analyzing a potential investment opportunity. "People will reveal themselves," Nathaniel whispered again. Just pay attention to how they treat those they perceive as beneath them. Outside the window, the scenery had dramatically changed. The lush green forests of the Northeast gave way to the vast golden fields of the Midwest. Inside the first-class cabin, the invisible currents of envy, prejudice, and kindness were quietly swirling, signaling an undercurrent that no one had yet noticed. 3 hours after takeoff, the rhythm of service in first class continued smoothly. However, beneath the polished exterior, subtle changes were beginning to emerge in the social dynamics of the cabin. Lauren Brooks had been replaced by Andrew Lewis for the mid-flight service, and this quickly altered the rhythm, especially in the way Dr. Richard Holloway behaved. With the male attendant, he made more direct requests, losing some of the usual condescension. Nathaniel Preston remained focused on his tablet, occasionally exchanging quick messages with the office. Meanwhile, Caleb Preston had finished his book and was now intently sketching in his notebook. The quick sketches, yet full of observation, were slowly taking shape. George Whitman with his kind eyes beneath thick brows, Evelyn Harrington with her graceful posture, always attentive. Dr. Holloway with his usual expression of impatience, Nathaniel leaned in to admire his son's drawing. "You really have a special eye for capturing people's essence," he commented. Caleb quickly closed his notebook, slightly embarrassed. "I'm just doodling for fun." "Don't underestimate your ability," Nathaniel said, his eyes glinting with pride. "Observation is a gift." Just then an unusual sound came from the economy cabin, followed by worried murmurs. Andrew quickly moved, disappearing behind the curtain. A few minutes later, Captain Grace Nakamura's voice came over the intercom. "Dear passengers, we have a medical emergency. If there are any doctors or medical personnel on board, please alert the flight attendants." "Doctor!" Holloway sighed loudly before reluctantly pressing the call button. When Andrew returned, Holloway spoke reluctantly. "I'm a cardiac surgeon." "What's the situation?" "We have a passenger with chest pain and shortness of breath." "We'd appreciate your assistance," Andrew replied, maintaining his professionalism, though it was clear he hesitated. Initially, Holloway glanced at his watch, still looking reluctant. "I have an important presentation in 4 hours. "Still, we would greatly appreciate your help," Andrew insisted. Finally, with a dramatic sigh, Holloway unbuckled his seat belt and stood up all right. Led the way, they quickly disappeared behind the curtain. Evelyn Harrington turned to Nathaniel, whispering softly, "Not everyone rushes to fulfill the Hippocratic oath. It seems everyone has their own way of living." Nathaniel replied smoothly. George Whitman, who had woken up due to the intercom announcement, shook his head in disapproval. "Back in the day, doctors came to your house to treat you. Now you have to beg them to help." "Not everyone is like that," Helen said gently. "Remember, Dr. Patel came to the house when you had the bad flu last winter." "That was an exception," George grumbled. In the economy cabin, Dr. Holloway was examining a middle-aged man drenched in sweat, clutching his left chest. His worried wife stood close by while the attendant prepared the emergency medical kit. "How long has he been experiencing symptoms?" Holloway asked, now fully professional. "Again, about 20 minutes, the wife answered. At first he thought it was heartburn, but now the pain has spread to his arm. Holloway took the patient's pulse and measured his blood pressure. "You're having a mild to moderate heart attack," he said in a calm tone. "It's not immediately life-threatening, but it's serious." Turning to the attendant, he asked, "Do we have aspirin and nitroglycerin on board?" "Yes." "Doctor?" "Good. Give the patient 325 milliliters of aspirin. Immediately prepare nitroglycerin and get oxygen ready." Then Holloway announced over the intercom, "This is Dr. Richard Holloway. We have a mild to moderate heart attack. The patient is stable, but will need medical attention once we land. I suggest continuing the journey unless the patient's condition worsens." Back in first class, people were discussing the medical emergency when Holloway walked in looking more upbeat than when he left. "How's the patient?" Nathaniel asked as he passed by stable. "It was probably just a mild heart attack. I administered first aid and advised continuing the journey." Holloway sat back down with a self-satisfied posture. "Good thing I have experience handling thousands of cases like this." "Glad to have you here," Evelyn said sincerely. Holloway nodded, accepting the praise with pride. "It's my duty, though I wish incidents like this didn't happen when I'm preparing for such an important presentation." From across the aisle, George let out a sound that resembled a suppressed chuckle. Helen gently squeezed her husband's hand, silently reminding him to stay quiet. Andrew Lewis returned to the first-class cabin, swiftly approaching Dr. Richard Holloway. "Dr. Captain Nakamura, thanks you for your assistance. The patient is stable now, and we've arranged for medical staff to meet us at San Francisco Airport." "Good," Holloway replied, nodding with satisfaction. "Please tell the captain I'll check the patient's condition again before we land." As Andrew left, Holloway turned to Nathaniel Preston. "This is why I emphasized the danger of distractions. Mr. Preston, in an emergency, the crew needs complete focus." Nathaniel nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. Safety should always come first." The conversation seemed to end there, but Caleb Preston, who had been quietly observing, suddenly spoke up. "But isn't the biggest priority helping others? I noticed you hesitated earlier." A flash of irritation crossed Holloway's face. "Young man, in medicine, we always have to prioritize. My research could save thousands of lives. Every minute of preparation is invaluable." "I understand," Caleb replied, though there was a faint hint of doubt in his voice. "It's just, it looked like you were weighing whether to help or not." Nathaniel gently reminded him, a subtle warning in his tone. Holloway narrowed his eyes, his voice colder. "When you spend decades saving patients, then you can judge my professional decisions. For now, it's best you focus on things young men like you still do." The remark landed like an unexpected blow, shattering the already fragile atmosphere. George Whitman cleared his throat, trying to ease the awkwardness. Evelyn Harrington raised an eyebrow full of unspoken meaning. Even Patricia Monroe paused, her work glancing up to assess the situation. Nathaniel quickly stood to diffuse the tension. "I apologize if my son was too blunt," he said calmly. "He's still learning how to converse with more tact." "No need to apologize, Mr. Preston." Holloway responded, his voice now even colder. "I just don't appreciate being questioned by those outside my field of expertise." There was a slight pause as he emphasized outside, making it clear the disdain behind his words. Caleb bit his lip, about to retort, but Nathaniel placed a hand on his, signaling for him to stay quiet. "Perhaps we should remain silent for a while," Nathaniel gently suggested. "This flight has already had enough incidents." The first-class cabin fell into an awkward silence, with only the steady hum of the engines filling the space. Andrew, understanding the situation, also withdrew behind the curtain. Helen Whitman leaned her head on George's shoulder, pretending to sleep, but her eyes were subtly open, quietly observing Ryan Keller was more engrossed in his laptop than ever. Caleb stared out the window, seeing only his reflection blurred against the glass, the tension he could hardly suppress evident on his face. Nathaniel maintained his calm exterior, but anyone who knew him well could tell by the slight tightening of his hands that he too was feeling the strain. Meanwhile, Holloway returned to his medical journal, flipping through the pages with a stiff, almost mechanical motion. It was clear that the anger wasn't just triggered by Caleb's question. It was the deeper discomfort of having his authority challenged by a young black man, especially when his father was respected in this cabin. Outside, the sunlight shifted its long rays, slashing across the cabin, drawing invisible lines between the people. In the economy cabin, the heart attack patient was resting more comfortably, unaware of the heavy atmosphere silently settling over first class. Below the plane, the vast fields of the Midwest had given way to the towering Rocky Mountains, their snow-capped peaks still visible despite the arrival of spring. As the plane passed over the mountains, it began to shake slightly due to air turbulence. The seatbelt sign illuminated, and once again the invisible tension in the cabin rose. Nathaniel was invited to the cockpit, as per Captain Nakamura's earlier invitation, leaving Caleb alone by the window. As he left his seat, Holloway shot Caleb a contemptuous glance, but said nothing. From across the aisle, Evelyn Harrington caught Caleb's eye and smiled encouragingly. "Your father told me you love both art and technology," she said, trying to draw him out of the tense atmosphere. "What are you planning to do after graduation?" Caleb appreciated the kindness and replied, "I'll be attending MIT this fall, majoring in computational design and visual arts." Interesting, Evelyn nodded. "In my time, those two fields had nothing to do with each other. George Whitman joined in. Back in the day, computers took up entire rooms. Now my grandkids hold phones in their hands that are more powerful than the NASA systems that landed on the moon." The conversation spread lightly across the cabin. Ryan Keller asked Caleb more about his passion for design, while Patricia Monroe occasionally chimed in with sharp comments about ethics in visual technology. Only Holloway remained distant, buried in his journal, as if he hadn't heard a word. When Nathaniel returned, he quickly sensed the change in the atmosphere. "Captain Nakamura sends her regards to everyone," he announced. "Though there's a slight headwind, we should still arrive on time." "Did you discuss the medical situation?" Holloway asked, his voice still tinged with skepticism. Richard Holloway asked, his tone tinged with skepticism regarding the captain's decision. Just a brief exchange, Nathaniel Preston responded calmly. "She appreciates your expertise and agrees with the recommendation to continue the journey." Holloway nodded, satisfied to see his position respected. For a moment, the earlier tension seemed to dissipate, giving way to the familiar rhythm of the flight. Lauren Brooks returned to the cabin, taking over from Andrew Lewis for the final service before landing. "We'll begin our descent into the San Francisco Bay Area in about 40 minutes, she announced. "I'll bring hot towels and drinks for everyone shortly." As Lauren walked down the aisle, Helen Whitman leaned over the seats and softly called, "Caleb Preston, grandson. Could you show me those sketches from earlier? I used to teach art at a community college, and I love seeing fresh perspectives." Caleb hesitated for a moment, then glanced at his father, who nodded encouragingly. He opened his notebook. "They're just quick sketches," he said, flipping open the pages. "Oh my goodness!" Helen exclaimed loud enough to catch the attention of nearby passengers. "George, you have to see this, George." Whitman leaned over, adjusting his glasses. "Wow, you even captured my furrowed brow perfectly." He laughed. "Can I take a picture to show the grandkids?" Caleb's notebook was quickly passed down the aisles, receiving compliments from Evelyn Harrington and even a thoughtful nod from Patricia Monroe. When the notebook reached Richard Holloway, he merely glanced at it and handed it back coldly. Muttering an interesting hobby, Nathaniel, who had been observing from the side, interjected, "Caleb's been drawing since he could hold a pencil. His mother was an artist she taught at Berkeley before we lost her." A heavy silence settled over the cabin. It wasn't just the mention of loss, but the way Nathaniel spoke of it, calm yet dignified. "I'm so sorry," Evelyn said softly. "How long has it been?" 8 years, Nathaniel replied. Caleb was just 9. Helen reached out, taking Caleb's hand. "She would be so proud of your talent," she said warmly. That brief moment of warmth created a small bubble of comfort in the air, one that even Holloway couldn't pierce. Just then, Lauren returned with the drink trays. "We'll be landing soon," she announced. "If anyone would like a drink before we descend, please let me know." The conversation in the cabin naturally shifted to plans after landing. George and Helen eagerly talked about reuniting with their grandchildren. Ryan Keller mentioned the packed meetings ahead in Silicon Valley. Evelyn Harrington laughed, saying she had dinner plans with an old friend at Nob Hill. Lauren approached Holloway Doctor. "Would you like a drink?" "Black coffee, please," he responded curtly. As she poured, he added, "How's the patient stable thanks to your help?" Lauren replied politely. Holloway nodded, taking the coffee with a self-satisfied expression. "I'll check on him one last time before we land." The atmosphere in the cabin had nearly returned to normal until Ryan Keller, perhaps feeling more at ease, boldly spoke up to Nathaniel. "Mr. Preston, may I have a few minutes to present our startup project? We've developed an algorithm." Before he could finish, Holloway cut him off, his voice sharp. "Now's not the time to pitch ideas. Some of us have real work to prepare for." The cold remark was like a stone thrown into a calm pond, sending uncomfortable ripples throughout the cabin. Nathaniel kept his calm demeanor while Caleb clenched his fists beside him. "I'm not bothered," Nathaniel said softly. "Sometimes the most creative ideas come from casual conversations." He gestured to Ryan. "Please continue." Ryan hesitated, glancing at Holloway, then at Nathaniel, gathering the courage to continue. "We've developed an algorithm that can predict drug interactions with 94% accuracy using only non-invasive biomarkers. It has the potential to revolutionize personalized medicine." "Impressive," Nathaniel nodded. "Have you published any research yet? We're preparing to submit a paper to the Journal of Biomedical Informatics." Ryan answered, "The biggest challenge now is scaling the technology." From the front rows, Holloway let out a faint chuckle. Half mockery. "Keller, I'm sorry, but breakthroughs like these pop up every quarter. Very few make it past clinical validation." Nathaniel tilted his head, his eyes sharp. "That's true for history, Dr. Holloway, but this field is evolving rapidly. Some innovations truly are changing the industry. In theory, it sounds good." Holloway replied, his tone dripping with disdain. "In reality, technologies like these are often overhyped by desperate entrepreneurs." Richard Holloway remarked, his voice cold and contemptuous. The implication was clear, and Ryan Keller reddened in embarrassment. "Our test results have been validated." Ryan tried to continue, but Holloway interrupted. "I'm sure they have." Holloway replied coldly, "Just as I'm sure Mr. Preston here has to listen to dozens of similar pitches every year, each one convinced their algorithm will forever change medicine." Nathaniel Preston maintained his calm tone. "I always find value in hearing directly from innovators. Some of our most successful investments have come from chance encounters like this." Caleb Preston, sitting next to his father and having observed the exchange, finally spoke up, his voice cutting through the cabin. "My dad started his first company in his college dorm. Back then, no major organization believed in his idea." Richard Holloway's gaze shifted to Caleb, cold and dismissive young man. He said, "There's a big difference between developing consumer technology and practicing medicine. One requires decades of rigorous training and a commitment to protecting human life. The other," he shrugged derisively, "any programmer can make an AP." The cabin seemed to deflate. The cool air from the AC felt colder now. Nathaniel remained calm, but anyone paying attention could notice the shift. His gaze sharpened, his silence one of deep consideration. "Dr. Holloway," he said slowly, "perhaps you're right. Different fields demand different standards. But in my experience, innovation doesn't know boundaries. Some of the most valuable ideas come from the most unexpected places. Convenient perspective for those who like to sell disruption." Holloway replied, his mouth curling into a cold smile. Before the conversation could escalate further, Captain Grace Nakamura's voice came over the intercom. "Dear passengers, we are beginning our descent into the San Francisco Bay Area. Please prepare for the descent." Lauren Brooks quickly moved down the aisle, collecting cups and ensuring all tray tables were stowed. The focus on the descent procedures cut through the tension, bringing a semblance of calm back to the cabin. The plane tilted slightly as it began its approach to SFO. Caleb turned to look at his father, receiving a reassuring nod, a familiar signal honed over many years of standing side by side. Whatever happens, they would face it together. Outside the window, the terrain shifted from the rugged peaks of Nevada to the characteristic golden hills of California, with small lakes glinting in the afternoon sun. Inside the cabin, the 12 passengers, strangers sharing this flight, were preparing to return to their individual lives. Yet none of them knew that their stories had quietly woven together, and the real test still lay ahead. Dear passengers, Lauren Brooks announced the seatbelt sign has been turned off for now. This is your last chance to use the restroom before we prepare for landing. Richard Holloway quickly took advantage of the break to return to the economy cabin after checking on the heart attack patient. All good, he declared when he sat back down, his voice full of self-satisfaction. With proper care at the hospital, he'll recover. Very fortunate, Helen Whitman said, sincerely. We're really lucky to have a doctor like you on board. Holloway nodded, accepting the compliment as if it were his due. It was just the right place at the right time, he replied. Not every flight has a cardiac surgeon on board. As Lauren passed by to check seat belts and seating arrangements, George Whitman turned to Caleb grandson. Does your father teach you about business? Will you be taking over someday? Before Caleb could answer, Holloway interjected his voice half-mockery. A family business tradition. Quite interesting, isn't it? Some fields deserve that more than others. The air thickened again. Nathaniel Preston looked up from his phone, his expression unreadable, but his voice firm. I believe in giving opportunities, not imposing paths. Caleb will choose his own way. My dad never forced me into tech. Caleb added, he's always supported my passion for art and design. Very progressive, Holloway commented, but his tone made the remark feel more like an accusation. Evelyn Harrington leaned forward, speaking with conviction. I think that's something to be appreciated. My husband tried to force our son into the banking business, and it took years for him to find his true passion in architecture. Tradition has its value, Holloway replied, just as standards exist for a reason. His tone carried a strange emphasis, a slight inflection that felt loaded with prejudice, something Caleb recognized immediately. It was the familiar sensation, the quiet bias wrapped in language, polite enough that no one could directly call it out, but it cut deep and sharp as it always did. Nathaniel Preston recognized the thickening atmosphere and placed his hand gently on Caleb's arm, signaling him to hold back. But when he spoke, his voice remained calm. Standards are important, Dr. Holloway, but so is progress. Medicine has advanced greatly by expanding diversity and embracing new perspectives. Some might argue that relaxing standards for the sake of diversity has led to undesirable results. Holloway responded, his tone heavy with implications. The air in the cabin grew thick. Even those trying to remain silent could hardly ignore the tension. Helen Whitman looked awkward, while Ryan Keller stared intently at the safety card in front of him as though it were the most interesting thing in the world. Only Patricia Monroe and Evelyn Harrington kept their eyes fixed on Holloway, coldly evaluating him. Nathaniel kept his voice steady as he replied, Some may think so, but numerous studies show that diverse teams perform better across all fields, including medicine. In any case, this may not be the best place to debate it. Indeed, Holloway agreed, but his gaze was full of self-satisfaction, as though he'd won some sort of argument. The seatbelt sign illuminated, followed by the captain's voice. Flight attendants, please take your seats for landing. Lauren Brooks quickly made one last round through first-class checking seatbelts and tray tables before taking her own seat. The plane began its descent heading toward San Francisco International Airport. Through the left window, the city's tall buildings sparkled in the afternoon sunlight. Inside the cabin, an artificial silence settled in. Caleb stared intently out the window, clenching his jaw to suppress his emotions. Nathaniel appeared calm, but anyone close to him would notice the slight rigidity in his shoulders, a subtle sign of a man accustomed to handling such situations. The events that followed happened so quickly that later the passengers couldn't agree on the exact sequence of events. As the plane descended below 10,000 feet, Lauren Brooks stood up to close an overhead bin that had been left ajar. At that moment, the plane hit a slight turbulence common when approaching the San Francisco Bay Area. Lauren lost her balance and grabbed the nearest seat for support. Unfortunately, it was Richard Holloway's "Get away!" Holloway snapped, jerking back, as if she had touched something filthy. "You almost spilled my water." "I'm sorry, sir," Lauren replied, trying to maintain her composure as she regained her balance. "Maybe if you focused on working instead of chatting with certain passengers." Holloway continued, his voice loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Incidents like this wouldn't happen." Lauren flushed but kept her professional demeanor. "I apologize for the inconvenience. I'll return to my seat to prepare for landing," she said, then quickly walked away. The atmosphere in the cabin froze. Caleb could no longer keep quiet, his voice cutting through the tension. "You don't have to act like that." Holloway turned, narrowing his eyes. "What did you say? It wasn't her fault. She was just doing her job." Nathaniel subtly signaled for his son to stop, but Holloway reacted first. "Young man," he said, "when you've traveled as much as I have, you'll understand that some standards need to be maintained, things your generation seems to have forgotten." His emphasis on your generation carried a clear undertone, one of disdain. Caleb slowly pushed his father's hand away, sitting up straight, his voice steady. "I think you're confusing standards with respect. They're not the same." "Enough, Caleb," Nathaniel quietly reminded him, but Caleb's gaze never left Holloway. Holloway's face darkened. "Your father's right. You should learn to listen. It seems there are still some lessons about manners that need to be taught more thoroughly." The plane continued its descent, and the ground grew closer. The cabin was so quiet that only the hum of the engines and the rising tension filled the space. Even George and Helen Whitman, who had been friendly from the start of the flight, sat in silence, staring straight ahead, avoiding involvement. "I respect those who earn it," Caleb said, undeterred. "Respect should be earned through actions, not just titles." A flash of fury passed through Holloway's eyes. "How arrogant," he growled. "This is what happens when children are pampered too much, when standards are lowered and mediocrity is celebrated as achievement." Dr. Holloway, Nathaniel's voice, finally broke the tension, sharp and cold. "Enough, not enough." Mr. Preston Holloway shot back, his voice louder. "Your son needs to understand that in the real world outside the bubble you've built, respect must be earned through achievements and discipline, not given as some consolation prize." The plane continued to descend, the wheels screeching on the runway, and the roar of the engines muffled the conversation, forcing the confrontation to end. All the passengers were pushed forward by the braking force, then leaned back as the plane slowed and taxied toward the terminal. Captain Grace Nakamura's voice came over the intercom. "Welcome to San Francisco International Airport. It is now 2:47 p.m., and the outside temperature is 20 degrees Celsius. Please remain seated until the plane has come to a full stop and the seatbelt sign has been turned off." As the plane slowly made its way toward the gate, the tensions from before still lingered in the air, dissipated but not gone. As the passengers in the cabin began to gather their belongings, checking their phones after switching off airplane mode, preparing to disembark, the tension remained palpable, especially between Caleb Preston and Dr. Richard Holloway, who was now deliberately avoiding Caleb's gaze. Nathaniel Preston leaned toward his son, whispering, "Let it go," he said gently. "We're about to land. It's over. Why should I let it go?" Caleb replied quietly, frustration clear in his voice. "He's been disrespectful throughout the whole flight because there are battles that aren't worth fighting." Nathaniel said, his tone calm. "We're about to step off this plane and we'll never have to deal with him again." Caleb nodded, but it was clear his mind wasn't settled. The plane continued to slowly taxi toward the gate, coming to a gentle stop as it connected to the jet bridge. The seatbelt sign chimed, signaling passengers that they could now unfasten their seatbelts. People immediately stood rummaging through overhead compartments and formed a long line in the aisle, eager to disembark. Holloway was one of the first to stand clearly, eager to exit the cabin as quickly as possible. Lauren Brooks's voice echoed through the intercom. "Dear passengers, please ensure you check the area around your seat to avoid leaving any belongings behind. On behalf of Captain Nakamura and the entire flight crew, we thank you for flying with us." The first-class passengers began to move toward the door, but just ahead of Nathaniel and Caleb, Richard Holloway stood in the aisle, directly blocking Caleb's path. The two stood there, neither speaking for a moment. Then Holloway spoke loud enough for those around them to hear, "I hope your father taught you a little something about personal space." Caleb frowned. "What do you mean?" "You're standing too close to me," Holloway said, though there was still at least a step between them. "But I suppose the concept of boundaries and polite distance has become outdated for your generation." Something in Caleb snapped. All the contemptuous looks, the veiled comments, the glances filled with bias throughout the flight, all of it came to a head in that moment. "What's your problem?" Caleb asked, his voice shaking with anger. Nathaniel placed a hand on his son's shoulder, warning him, but Holloway had already started to respond, his tone condescending. "My problem, young man, is the arrogance I've witnessed throughout this flight. The belief that you deserve to be treated on par with those who have spent their entire lives earning their positions. You don't know anything about me?" Caleb shot back, his voice rising. "You don't know what I've had to sacrifice, I can tell just by looking." Holloway sneered, a child who's been sheltered by his father's shadow, thinking he has the right to lecture those who've been there before him. The flow of passengers had slowed to a halt, now completely stopped. All eyes turned toward the confrontation. Lauren Brooks quickly moved toward them, concern written all over her face. "Please, let's maintain order," she said. But Holloway ignored her. "Let me put it bluntly, since civility seems to be outdated with you lot," he continued, "this world has standards. Standards that existed long before the trend of equality watered down the value of achievement." At this point, there was no mistaking the true meaning behind Holloway's words. The thin veneer of politeness had fallen away, revealing a naked bias. Caleb clenched his fists, his body shaking with anger and humiliation. Nathaniel tightened his grip on his son's shoulder, but his gaze too had darkened as if a storm were brewing inside him. Dr. Holloway Nathaniel's voice was now cold and sharp. "I suggest you leave the plane now before you say something you'll regret." "Regret?" Holloway let out a bitter laugh. "The only regret here is watching the decline of excellence in the name of diversity. Your son may benefit from this lowered standard now, but in the real world, the sound of a slap cracked through the cabin like a gunshot. The entire first-class cabin fell silent. Caleb Preston brought his hand to his cheek. His eyes darkened in shock, staring at the furious, red-faced man in front of him. "There's no place for you here." Holloway hissed, his voice trembling with anger. "I paid $20,000 for peace and quiet not to be surrounded by..." Before he could finish, the cabin erupted into chaos. Two well-dressed men, Nathaniel's security detail, immediately surged forward from the front of the cabin. In just a few seconds, they had restrained Holloway, twisting his arms behind his back and pressing him against the partition. Lauren Brooks's voice came through the intercom. "Panicked captain. There's an incident in first class." Nathaniel remained seated, his face almost expressionless, his hand resting on Caleb's shoulder, his voice calm. "Stay calm. This is what we talked about." No one noticed Evelyn Harrington in seat 3C quietly recording the entire incident on her phone. No one noticed the attendants awkwardly trying to regain control, and no one realized that Captain Grace Nakamura had already radioed for security assistance at the gate. What had seemed like a routine flight was ending in turmoil. All the layers of politeness, the facades of success, had collapsed, revealing the harsh truth that despite achievements, wealth, or credentials, discrimination still lurked ready to erupt raw and ruthless when the moment was right. At the end of the jet bridge, airport security stood ready and waiting. As the security team boarded the plane in response to Captain Nakamura's call, Dr. Richard Holloway stood frozen in the cabin, facing consequences he never anticipated this morning. Nathaniel Preston. The man who had spent his life calmly navigating similar situations knew this time would be different, because this time there were witnesses, clear evidence. And this time, the one bearing the brunt of the pain was his son. The real story of Flight 237 had only just begun. 3 hours after the plane landed at San Francisco International Airport, the video recorded by Caroline Westfield had attracted over 2 million views. With a steady hand, Evelyn Harrington had captured the entire incident. In high definition, Holloway's fury, the sharp slap, and the swift response from Nathaniel Preston's security team. What made matters worse, the sound was crystal clear, capturing every venomous word Holloway uttered, despite the noise from the aircraft engines. In the VIP lounge of Terminal 3, Nathaniel Preston sat across from Captain Grace Nakamura, both of them still processing what had just transpired. Caleb Preston was in the next room answering questions from airport police under the supervision of the family's lawyer, James Wilson. "I've known you for 15 years, Nathaniel Nakamura said, pushing her untouched coffee cup away. "In all that time, I've never seen you lose control." "I didn't lose control," Nathaniel replied calmly. "My security team only responded after my son was assaulted." Nakamura nodded slowly. "The airline will fully support you. The flight attendants and several passengers have confirmed that Dr. Holloway was the aggressor." "Where is he now?" Nathaniel asked. "The airport police are handling it." "Since this was an in-flight incident, the FBI has also gotten involved," Nakamura explained. "But with the video and witness statements, I think he'll at least be charged with assault." Nathaniel's face remained impassive, but a cold glint flickered in his eyes. "The issue isn't just about charging," he said. "This is about responsibility." "I understand," Nakamura replied, though her voice suggested she didn't fully grasp it. As an Asian woman who had risen through the ranks in the aviation industry, she was no stranger to bias, but she knew her experience and Nathaniel's were still fundamentally different. The door opened. Caleb and lawyer James Wilson entered. The young man looked tired but composed. The faint red mark still visible on his left cheek, a clear reminder of what had occurred. "How's it going?" Nathaniel stood to ask. "They've got everything on record." Wilson reported. Caleb spoke clearly and truthfully, no embellishments. Nathaniel placed his hand on his son's shoulder. "Are you okay?" Caleb nodded. "I'm fine. Just want this to be over quickly. We can leave." Wilson confirmed. "The car's waiting. I've also arranged for extra security at the hotel, since the media is all over this." At the mention of the media, Nathaniel's expression darkened. "How bad is it the video's going viral?" Wilson admitted. "Major TV networks, social media. Everyone's talking about it. Holloway's being heavily criticized, and frankly, he deserves it. Massachusetts General Hospital just issued a statement that they're conducting an internal investigation, meaning they're looking to sever ties." And Caleb. Nathaniel asked, his voice lowering. Wilson hesitated, glancing at Caleb. Most of the comments are positive. People are praising Caleb's restraint. Some articles are even using this incident to discuss the experiences of black people in America, even those with wealth and status. Caleb sighed quietly. "I know," he said. "I've seen a few articles already." Nathaniel gently squeezed his son's shoulder. "I never wanted you to go through this." "It's not your fault," Caleb replied. "No," Nathaniel nodded. "But I have a responsibility for how we handle it." He turned to Wilson. "I want an official statement within the hour. Short, dignified, but clear." We'll thank the support, but emphasize that this is much bigger than a single person or an incident on a flight." Wilson nodded, pulling up his tablet to take notes. "What about Dr. Holloway?" he asked. Nathaniel paused for a moment before answering. "We don't need to request specific punishment or termination. We just need to say that our expectation is for the relevant organizations to act with proper responsibility." Caleb interjected, "Isn't that a bit too lenient?" "Dad," Nathaniel looked directly into his son's eyes. "No," he said, his voice carrying weight. "It places the burden on the whole system, not just one person. Trust me." At that moment, Captain Nakamura spoke up. "The airline CEO has requested a direct conversation with you, Nathaniel. They're prepared to issue a lifetime flight ban for Holloway." "Good." Nathaniel nodded. "That's the right thing to do." As the conversation continued, Caleb silently observed his father realizing something he had never fully understood before. He had always known Nathaniel Preston as a powerful man. He had grown up in the shadow of that success, benefiting from the privileges it afforded. But seeing him now calm, sharp, methodically shaping how the world would perceive this incident, Caleb realized that true power didn't come from money or fame. It came from self-control, from the wisdom in every reaction, and Caleb knew he still had much to learn. Nathaniel Preston's voice broke through Marcus's thoughts, his question slicing through the tension like a calm breeze. "What do you want from this?" The question caused Marcus to pause, caught off guard. "What do you mean, Dad?" "This isn't just about me or our family," Nathaniel continued. "What result would make you feel like justice was served?" Marcus thought for a long while, the room waiting for his answer. "I want him to face real consequences," Marcus finally said. "Not just temporary shame or a few words of criticism. I want him to understand that every action carries weight." Nathaniel nodded, his eyes glowing with pride. "Then that will be our goal." They were preparing to leave the airport when James Wilson received a text. His expression changed immediately as he read the message. "You should see this," Wilson said, handing Nathaniel his phone. A breaking news alert flashed on the screen. "Famous surgeon suspended after racist incident on United flight right below" was a statement from Massachusetts General Hospital. "We are deeply aware of the video involving Dr. Richard Holloway. The behavior shown in the video completely contradicts the values of equality and dignity that our hospital strives to uphold. Dr. Holloway has been immediately suspended pending a full investigation." Nathaniel didn't say anything, simply handing the phone to Marcus. He read the news, his face showing a complex expression, not exactly joy, but more like the sense of some kind of justice being restored. "That was fast," Captain Grace Nakamura remarked. "The video is crystal clear," Wilson replied. "In this day and age, organizations can't afford to hesitate when all the evidence is laid bare like that." They gathered their bags, preparing to face the crowd of reporters outside. Nathaniel pulled Marcus aside for a private moment. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice quiet, so only the two of them could hear. "I'm angry," Marcus admitted, "and disappointed. I keep thinking about the people sitting in the cabin. Most of them just sat there and watched it happen." "Not everyone." Nathaniel reminded him. Caroline Westfield stood up. "One person is enough to change everything." He adjusted Marcus's tie, a small gesture of both protection and tradition. "You handled yourself well today. I want you to know that I wanted to hit him," Marcus confessed. "When he slapped me, I really wanted to react." "I know," Nathaniel replied softly, "but your restraint isn't weakness. It's wisdom. You understand what I've always tried to teach. We don't have the luxury of reacting impulsively. Even when we're wronged, we have to fight with our minds." Marcus nodded, though his heart still weighed heavily with the truth that even as the son of one of the most powerful men in America, he still had to play by the unfair rules that people like Holloway never had to consider. "Ready to go?" Nathaniel asked, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. Ready. Marcus answered his voice firmer than before. Together they stepped out of the waiting room and into the sea of people, and flashing cameras ready to face the storm, not because it would be easy, but because they had been tempered by countless moments of quiet resilience before later that evening, in the luxurious suite at the Four Seasons Hotel, while the media storm raged outside, Nathaniel and Marcus sat in the living room watching the news coverage that had taken over the national airwaves. "Turn it off," Nathaniel said, as another group of commentators began analyzing the racial angle. For the third time that day, Marcus pressed the button. The screen went dark. In the sudden silence, the weight of the entire day seemed to collapse upon them. "What do we do tomorrow?" Marcus asked. Still as planned, Nathaniel replied, "We're not changing our schedule because of this." "What about Holloway?" Nathaniel paused, thinking for a moment. "He'll face an internal investigation. There could be civil lawsuits. With that video, it's going to be hard for him to deny anything." Nathaniel Preston's eyes locked with his son's, a quiet yet deliberate intensity in his gaze. "Do you want to sue him?" Nathaniel asked. Marcus paused, shaking his head slowly. "No. What I mean is, he deserves to face real consequences, but a lawsuit would just keep us tied to him longer." "Exactly," Nathaniel nodded. Sometimes the strongest response is to stay the course rather than letting someone else's actions dictate your direction. Before Marcus could respond, a knock on the door interrupted their conversation. James Wilson entered with a woman in her 50s, impeccably dressed and radiating calm authority. "Solomon Marcus, this is Ms. Rachel Dawson from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division." Wilson introduced. She would like to have a brief meeting. Nathaniel stood to shake her hand. "Good afternoon, Ms. Dawson. This is unexpected, but a pleasure." "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice," she replied, turning to Marcus. "You must be Marcus. I'm very sorry for what you've had to go through today." Marcus nodded subtly, unsure how to respond to an apology coming from a federal level. They sat down together. "The reason I'm here, Ms. Dawson began, is that the incident on the flight today may fall under federal jurisdiction, not just assault, but also a potential civil rights violation." Nathaniel kept his face neutral. "Please continue. Based on the video evidence and witness testimony, we're considering charging Dr. Richard Holloway under federal hate crime statutes. The assault, coupled with the clearly discriminatory remarks, creates a strong case." Marcus turned to look at his father, surprised by the development. "We'll need the family's cooperation, primarily as witnesses." Dawson continued, "Marcus's testimony is particularly important." Nathaniel was silent for a moment. "And if he's charged, the penalties are severe?" She replied, "Even with his age and prior record, Holloway may not face the maximum sentence, but the conviction alone would end his medical career and result in actual prison time." The room fell silent. Marcus felt his heart twist. The desire for justice conflicted with the weight of possibly ruining someone's life. Someone who had slapped him, but still a human life. "We appreciate the interest of the Department of Justice," Nathaniel said, breaking the silence. "Before making a decision, I'd like to have a private conversation with my son." "Of course," Ms. Dawson stood. "Mr. Wilson has my contact information. We'll need a response within 48 hours if you want to proceed with the prosecution." After they left, Nathaniel turned to Marcus. "The decision is yours, not mine." Marcus was taken aback. Really? You're the one who was attacked. You'd be the one testifying in court, and you're old enough to understand the weight of this choice." "So if it were you, what would you do?" Nathaniel thought for a long while. 20 years ago, I would have demanded the harshest sentence. Back then, I was angrier and believed that justice had to be strict. But I've learned the difference between justice and vengeance, between responsibility and annihilation. Do you think we shouldn't prosecute? I'm not saying that. I just think we need to understand what our goal is. Do we want him to be held accountable? Do we want to set an example for society, or do we just want to feel vindicated? Each choice leads us down a different path. Marcus walked over to the window, gazing out at the twinkling lights of San Francisco. When he hit me, he said quietly, "It wasn't just about me. It's about every time someone like him has done that to someone like me and never had to face consequences." "Exactly," Nathaniel nodded. "You're not wrong. So, don't we have a responsibility to go all the way for those who don't have bodyguards and a billionaire father to protect them?" Nathaniel walked up to his son, placing a hand on his shoulder. Maybe our responsibility is to prove that justice can still be strong without needing to destroy not all consequences need to be prison time. Isn't that letting him get away lightly? It's different in intent and degree. In the final result, Nathaniel replied, "Richard Holloway has lost his position, his dignity, and his career. The shadow of his actions will follow him for the rest of his life. The question is, does a federal sentence really bring justice, or is it just revenge?" Marcus fell silent. "What would happen if you were the one who hit him?" he asked. The question hung in the air. The answer was clear, even if unspoken. Nathaniel sighed. "That's the crux of it, isn't it? The injustice, not just in the action, but in how society handles the aftermath." "So what do we do now?" Marcus asked. Nathaniel looked his son squarely in the eyes. "We'll make sure he's held accountable. Not necessarily through a federal prison sentence that could turn him into a victim for public sympathy, but through a civil lawsuit where he has to face his actions, pay compensation, and can't hide from the truth. We will use our voice." Nathaniel said, not just to reflect on an incident, but to change the system that nurtured it. "Our goal is not to destroy a person, but to change what made him act the way he did." Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes cast down, accepting this truth as the final lesson from the fateful flight. I need more time to think." "You have until tomorrow evening," Nathaniel gently reminded him. "Whatever you choose, I will fully support you." Marcus withdrew into his room. Nathaniel remained by the window, gazing out at the San Francisco night sky, where just a day ago everything seemed so normal. Just 24 hours. What started as a routine business trip had now become the focal point of a national conversation about racism, power, and responsibility. He thought of his wife Adeline, who had passed away many years ago. Her words still echoed in his memory. "Don't just think about winning. Remember who you are fighting for and who you will become when the battle is over." The next morning, as the first light of dawn began to paint the San Francisco Bay in gold, Marcus stepped out of his room. He had made his decision a week later in a law office downtown. Nathaniel and Marcus Preston sat facing Richard Holloway, once a renowned doctor, now merely a shadow of himself. Beside him was his lawyer, her sharp features and gaze showing that she understood the hopelessness of the situation. This meeting was not a trial, but a final opportunity, an alternative to the still pending federal charges. Nathaniel spoke first, his tone calm but decisive. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. We believe that we can still reach a solution better for all parties involved rather than getting entangled in prolonged legal proceedings." The lawyer nodded. "My client fully understands the gravity of the situation. He is ready to take appropriate responsibility." Holloway remained silent, his eyes cast downward, uncertain whether it was out of regret, fear, or mere calculation. "Before we present our proposal," Nathaniel said, "my son has something he would like to say." Marcus sat up straight, his eyes locking onto Holloway's. He had spent the entire week preparing for this moment. "Dr. Holloway," Marcus began, his voice calm but clear, "I've thought a lot about what happened that day, about why you thought you had the right to treat me the way you did, both in words and in actions." Holloway briefly glanced up, then looked away again. "I'm not here to receive an apology," Marcus continued. "I'm here because I want you to understand this. What you did wasn't just about me. It's about a whole system, a system that has taught those with privilege that they can insult, degrade others, and never face consequences." Nathaniel silently watched his son, pride shining in his eyes. This wasn't revenge, it was maturity. "Our proposal is as follows," Marcus continued. "Instead of federal charges, we ask for three things: a significant contribution to scholarships for students of color pursuing medical careers, mandatory participation in a series of race awareness training programs with documentation and assessments. And finally, you must make a public statement about this incident and what you've learned from it." Holloway's lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently. After a few minutes of exchange, she turned back. "My client values this opportunity." But the third condition, the public statement, means the end of any chance to restore his career. "His actions have already done that," Nathaniel replied bluntly. "It's not our condition," Marcus added, his gaze unwavering. "We're not asking for public shaming. We're asking for transparency. Those are two entirely different things." For the first time, Holloway spoke, his voice thick with emotion and exhaustion. "You don't know what you're asking for. I've dedicated my life to medicine. I've saved thousands of lives." Marcus nodded. "I believe that, and that makes your actions even less acceptable. A person who's saved so many lives chooses to harm a child just because of their skin color. Because of that past, you must take responsibility for your present. This won't erase what you've done." Marcus said, his voice calm, "but it exists alongside it, just like my accomplishments will always be tied to my skin color. Something you thought was not worthy of respect." The whole room fell silent as those words ended. Richard Holloway seemed to age right before their eyes, his shoulders slumping his face, finally revealing the full weight of the actions he himself had caused. "If I refuse," he asked, "then we will support the Department of Justice in pursuing hate crime charges," Nathaniel answered plainly. "The evidence is clear, and the witnesses are credible. The punishment will be far more severe than what we are proposing." Holloway's lawyer gently placed her hand on his, whispering something. Then she turned to them. "We need some time to discuss this privately. May we be excused?" Nathaniel nodded, and he and Marcus stepped out of the room. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. Marcus nodded. "Seeing him like that, I didn't think I'd be so calm. He looks so small. Power often looks different when it's forced to face responsibility." Nathaniel replied, "You spoke very well. Your mother would be proud." The door opened and the lawyer motioned for them to return. "My client agrees to the terms with one request for modification. He hopes that the public speaking engagements will be limited to medical conferences and academic institutions rather than the broader public." Nathaniel turned to Marcus. After a moment of consideration, he nodded. "All right, as long as the content of the speeches is third-party, vetted to ensure it stays on topic." In the next hour, the terms were agreed upon: a $2 million donation to a scholarship fund for students of color pursuing medical careers, participation in a racial bias training program, and a series of lectures at medical schools on discrimination within the healthcare industry. Before leaving, Holloway finally looked at Marcus and said, his voice choked, I regret what I did that day." Not exactly an apology, but perhaps it was all that a proud man like him could muster. Marcus responded, his words ringing clearly in the quiet room. "Dr. Holloway, what I hope you'll regret is not just hitting me, but the mindset that made you think that was acceptable. That's what needs to change, not just in you, but in every place where that thinking still exists." Outside the office, as Marcus and Nathaniel walked to the car, a reporter called out, Mr. Harrington, do you have any comment on today's settlement?" Nathaniel paused, thought for a moment, then replied, "Today wasn't just about a settlement. It was a choice to choose responsibility over retaliation. We believe that real change doesn't come from punishment, but from education, from reflection, and from the commitment to do better." As the flashbulbs popped, Marcus realized this moment held a deep significance. It wasn't just closing a painful chapter, but opening a new model for justice, not through vengeance, but through transformation. In the weeks that followed, the story of Flight 237 was no longer just about two individuals. It was discussed in classrooms, medical conferences, and at dinner tables across the country. Richard Holloway, stripped of his surgical privileges, but not yet disbarred, began his journey of relearning from scratch. His first lecture to medical students was a clumsy yet sincere attempt to explain the arrogance and bias that had shaped his career. Meanwhile, Marcus Preston Harrington, with his maturity beyond his years, carried this lesson with him to MIT and beyond. He understood more than ever the power of a strategic response, the importance of measured justice, and the belief that even the deepest wounds, if faced with wisdom and goodwill, could become opportunities for change. As the car pulled away from the curb, Nathaniel glanced at his son, seeing in him not just the gentle artistry of his mother or the strategic thinking of himself, but a unique identity, Marcus, who would help create a world where events like Flight 237 would only be a memory of a less civilized time. Flight 237 had landed safely, but the journey it sparked was still ongoing. Perhaps what makes the story of Flight 237 so special is not just the slap, the anger, or the confrontation between two generations, but rather how the people involved chose to respond. They didn't choose revenge, they didn't choose silence, they chose dialogue, they chose responsibility, and most importantly, they chose to hope that better things will come if we are brave enough to act right, even in the smallest of moments. This journey didn't end when the plane touched down. It continues through every conversation, every action, every choice that you and I will make. After this video ends, if this story has made you pause, reflect, or simply feel something real, please leave a like, share it with those you believe should hear it, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Let us know in the comments, how would you choose justice? And have you ever witnessed or experienced something similar? Thank you for being with us. See you in the next stories where emotions lead the way and the heart is always the final destination.